So when we look at the cardiovascular system, the heart is core or centered to this, but all the blood vessels that are included, that distribute blood to and from the heart, are also included in that. And these include the smaller vessels in between the veins and the arteries, the capillaries. But the three major elements of a circulatory system is a pump, in this case the heart, channels or tubes, in this case blood vessels, and a fluid medium, and in this case blood. The heart gets center stage, it gets the biggest attention, but it does include this whole vascular supply, and some would argue that the vascular supply, this distribution, is just as important. When we look at the heart includes all of the structure, so it's not just the muscle, but the tubes, the ports, the valves, the chambers that are there. And then, as mentioned, we have the respiratory system as well, but you can see that the blood vessels do enter through those lungs, and there's a gas exchange that occurs. And in fact, that's the primary role of the circulatory system, is to exchange blood through the body, pick up waste products, drop off waste products, and we'll explore what that is. We'll also look at the cardiac response, particularly under stress, or in this case under exercise. And we'll look at the heart rate response and the things that go along with that. And then lastly, we'll look at the respiratory system, both from the volume pressure changes that get air from the atmosphere into the lungs, but we'll also look at it from a core or spinal stabilization. So you have the pressure changes here that are bringing air in based on the diaphragm, but then you have pressure changes here that are changing spinal stabilization. And the last thing we'll look at is the blood, which is the medium which things are transported through. This is like the red blood cell superhighway. This image is from the article on the blackboard shell. And oxygen and carbon dioxide are the primary aspects, but keep in mind that this is a network or highway that other things can be distributed in, particularly hormones and nutrients. We'll start the conversation with the heart. And the heart historically has been graphically depicted as this. This is nothing what the heart looks like. I don't even think the color is right. This is accurate in terms of color and shape and somewhat disgusting. This is nice, like, ooh, pleasant Valentine's Day, and this is real life. And yes, the heart will beat on its own if pulled out of the chest cavity. That's a plug to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. As mentioned, the heart is a pumping system, and there's two circuits that are involved in the circulatory system. You have the pulmonary system, so anytime you see the word pulmonary, that's referring to the lungs. And you have the systemic circuit, so that's talking about everything else. So all the tissues, the recipient of that blood flow. In the image on the right, you can see that it's depicting the gas exchange. So at the lungs, it's dropping off waste product, carbon dioxide, and picking up oxygen. And then it's distributing it through to the cells that are then using oxygen and dropping off CO2 or carbon dioxide. This is in entirety, the entire circulatory system. You can see the blood vessel exchange of the lungs at the top. You can see the heart. The heart chambers on the left are dedicated to the pulmonary system, to distributing blood flow to the lungs, whereas the right side of the heart is distributing blood to the rest of the system. So two independently systems, but it's a closed circuit, meaning blood flow on the left is eventually going to end up blood on the right and vice versa. And the chambers, the pump, is pumping at the same time. So the left and right side are working in unison. If we take a peek inside the heart, we'll see that it's mostly empty. There are four chambers. There's the atriums on the top and the ventricles at the bottom. There are valves that separate the atrium from the ventricles, and then there's valves that separate the ventricle from the desired blood flow. So there's a very particular structure within the heart, particular pipe work to move blood to and from, and then there's major valves to shut things down to keep blood where it needs to go. If we label all the structures and we look at all the things that are there, it can be a little bit overwhelming. This is the image from your book, and everything here has a role, purpose. But when we start studying the heart, I think it's better to break it down into smaller components. And when we start with this, we start with the four primary chambers and the four primary valves. So this is a schematic. This is your heart right here. If we drew a line right down here and separate it from left and right, and we drew kind of a quasi line right here and separated top and bottom halves, you'd end up with an image like this. So here's your right side of the heart. Here's your left side of the heart. That's if you were laying on the table face up, this would be your right side. This would be your left side. This is the vena cava here. This is the final vein, or the largest vein of the body. So think of it as a tributary river. All the blood from the body is collecting into these smaller veins, and it's pooling here in the vena cava, and the vena cava's final destination is right here in the right atrium. So all the blood comes here in the right atrium. You have your valve here, your tricuspid valve, that separates the atrium from the ventricle. You have the bicuspid valve over here, but sometimes referred to as the mitral valve. You can see that the atriums are on top and the ventricles are on the bottom. You have the pulmonary valve, and then you have the aortic valves, and these are valves that are keeping blood in the ventricle before they go off to the pulmonary system or into the aorta before they go to the rest of the body. If I take this image and I make it a little bit more organized, you can kind of look at the heart as a quadrant system. So again, here's your top side of the heart, here's your left and right halves distributed from between the pulmonary system and the systemic system. You have your right atrium, and you can kind of see the blood flow through the tricuspid valve. It goes down to the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve onto the lungs. And then from the lungs, it's collecting in the left atrium, down the mitral valve, left ventricle. So you see your two independent systems here, and you can see it in its entirety in this view here. So you got the right side of the heart that's dealing with deoxygenated blood distributing to the lungs. That blood is coming back to the left side of the heart to be pumped out to the body. That does a gas exchange here. Tissues do their work. They're happy. They're fed. They got their oxygen. And then that waste product and the carbon dioxide goes back to the heart, here to the right side of the heart to be shut off to the lungs. And the cycle completes over and over and over again. What you can see here is that there's a very specific blood flow through the heart, and it's designed that way. And this is a passive process. So there's really no way under normal physiological conditions for heart to go the opposite direction. That you might get a drop here and there that gets reserved here and doesn't go all the way down. But for the most part, blood's not moving from this direction there. You can see the way these valves are designed, and you can see that these little tendons or cords here, they keep the flaps of this direction so that never ever do the flaps ever backlog into here, because you always want blood flow following these arrows. So here's the systemic circulation. So you can see that it's going to the lungs, from the lungs back to the heart. Blood always enters the heart through the atrium. So you can see the right atrium here, and you can see the left atrium over here. Blood in the right atrium is coming from the body, depicted in blue because it's low in oxygen or oxygen poor blood. The atrium are like the staging areas for the ventricles. So like when you walk into a building, you usually walk into the atrium first, and then from there you go to the service desk and you go into the elevator wherever your destination is, and from there. So the atrium is the same aspect. Before the blood gets to the main action, the ventricles, these are the main pumps, they collect in the atrium first. From the atrium, they generate a certain amount of volume, and then with each contraction, they're pushed from the atrium down through the valve into the ventricle. And the blood flow in the right atrium and the left atrium is happening at the same time. So when the right atrium is emptying into the right ventricle, the left atrium is also emptying into the left ventricle. These valves close, and then you get another contraction, and then as this is filling up, this is contracting its contents up through these valves. So this is the pulmonary system out to the lungs, and this is up through the aorta out to the body. So very specific blood flow, starting here from the atrium down to the ventricle, through the pulmonary valve, out to the left and right lungs. It does its gas exchange at the lungs and comes back, and it's ending back here at the the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and then pushed up through the ventricle and out through the ventricle, through the aorta, and then out through the body, going to the head, neck, shoulders, hips, and so forth. So that is the blood flow of the heart, and you should know this blood flow, like where the blood's going, where it's ending up, where it's coming from. You can kind of see the schematic now. We'll add some of the labels back in. Here's the right atrium. Here's the tricuspid valve. This is the right ventricle. Here's the pulmonary valve. And now you can make a little bit more sense of it what this structure is, and so forth. So we'll go one more slide. We'll go to revisit the slide that we did before. And now that we kind of have an idea and we've seen those schematics, this is not so overwhelming. So it's just going to take some time to get used to seeing what you're seeing, understanding this quadrant system. Right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. A is first in the alphabet, so it's going to be on top. V, the point at the bottom. However you want to remember it. Just realize that blood always ends up in the atrium. It goes from atrium to ventricle, and ventricle to destination. So right side of the heart's going to the lungs, left side of the heart going to the body. So if we look at this same slide now, with the arrow superimposed on the blood flow, you can see now that the right atrium is the recipient of all the blood from the body. So both from top and bottom. So the head, the feet, the arms, the fingertips. This is where all the deoxygenated blood collects. At the same time, the left atrium is filling up with blood from the lungs, and it's staging in this area to be pumped from the atrium down to the ventricle, both right and left at the same time. This is always closed, so the blood here never interacts here. The only way blood gets here from the right side to the left side is if it goes all the way out to the lungs and comes all the way back, or it goes all the way out to the body and comes back to the atrium. So the blood is staged here in the atrium. It's kept here by the tricuspid valve, and then once the heart contracts, it pushes blood this way down, preventing any blood from regurgitating back. Here, that blood collects again, right ventricle, and gets ready to be pushed out to here, the pulmonary system, out to the lungs. This goes to the lungs, comes back, collects at the atrium, gets pushed through the mitral valve, down into left ventricle, and out to the body, into the arterial supply. So here's our schematic here. This is the same image that we showed earlier without the labels, and here's a smaller version of that schematic. And what I would do is I would take this blank heart here and use it as a worksheet. Now you have an image of like this on the Blackboard shell, and you can find all types of worksheets, but I would take some time and label it. So you know, just to kind of, with the arrows, so you can have your blood flow through the body and have a good understanding of that. Right, here's your left side of the heart, right side of the heart, separated by the intraventricular septum. You have your ventricles down here. Here is your tricuspid valve. There's your mitral valve. So blood's coming down through the vena cava, collecting here at the right atrium. From here, the right atrium, the blood's being pumped down to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is contracting and it's pushing the blood. It can't go back to this valve. It's blocked. So the only way it can go is through this pulmonary valve up into the pulmonary system. Blood can't come back in. It can only go out. From here, it's going out to the lungs. Gas exchange is occurring at the lungs. It's being brought back. And from there, it's collecting back into the pulmonary, from the pulmonary system into the left atrium. From left atrium, it's being pumped down through the mitral valve. And then from the left ventricle up through the aortic valve and into the aorta to go up to the head, neck, and shoulders, and then down to the rest of the body. So that's the blood flow through the heart and the heart itself. So I would definitely know those four structures, the four chambers, the four valves, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other structures. But keep in mind the heart is a muscle. It has similar contractile properties where it's able to generate force and shorten when it needs to. The interesting thing here is you look at the skeletal muscle and we have this nice parallel alignment, sarcomere to sarcomere, dependent upon input from the nervous system to contract. And you can see here that the cardiac muscle has somewhat of a similar parallel aspect, but it has all these branches that come off. So think of this as like stacked wood that's all piled up nice and perfect alignment, like long strands of hair. And when you look at cardiac muscle, think of a bunch of branches that are together where you got some branches overreaching to the other side. We also have smooth muscle in the body, and anything that's a tube, so like your large intestine, your small intestine, or in this case, the blood vessels, has this type of muscle, and these are bundled together kind of like licorice. And what they do is they're able to contract and change their diameter. So you can go from constricted or expand to dilated, and then what this does within the circulatory system is this adjusts the amount of blood flow that can happen. So here's your cardiac muscle, more blown up, and you can see that instead of having these sarcomeres, it has these sections, and you can see that they're not uniform. It's not like you have like right in a row. You have these intercalated discs, and the interesting thing about cardiac muscle is that it can contract spontaneously. It is not dependent upon input from the nervous system to contract. The heart does have an electrical system, but it's self-regulatory, so it means it contracts. It's influenced by the nervous system, meaning that it can increase or decrease heart rate depending upon the inputs, but it's not dependent upon the nervous system to generate a contraction of the heart. This slide is in your notes and in your Blackboard shell, but it looks at the comparison between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Again, the skeletal muscle are like those long strands of hair that run from end to end, whereas cardiac muscle is more tangled up into knots. The fiber types in muscle have a variety, right? You have your type 1, which is your slow twitch, endurance, fatigue, resistance. Then you have your type 2, which is force production. There's only one type of fiber type in cardiac muscle, and you don't need a lot of contraction, and you certainly don't need muscle in the heart that's fatigable. You want the heart to always be beating. At time of conception, like 6 weeks in, and at time of death, your heart's beating longer than you're breathing, right? So your heart is working from the day in the womb, and it is constantly working, and so you never want it to get to a fatigue state. And then the last thing is that the skeletal muscle is voluntary, right? So when we look at these muscles here, this is under voluntary control. This is not. This is dependent upon input from the nervous system, particularly the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. But with the heart muscle, it is spontaneous, and it has a particular rhythm, about 100 beats per minute. So when the cardiac muscle contracts, unlike skeletal muscle where the two ends are being pulled together, there's not a distinct end and start point or attachment site for cardiac muscle. It just kind of exists. And what you can see here is you can see relaxed muscle on the left, and you can see contract muscle on the right. And what it's doing, it's encroaching or enclosing upon this space. So when the muscle contracts or overlaps, it basically squishes out. So if you took like a water bottle with the cap off and you squeeze the outside, water squirts out the top. That's how cardiac muscle contracts. So when you think of heart contraction, think of it squeezing more than shortening. The other interesting thing about cardiac muscle is that there's not distinct start and end points, and it's not distinct muscles. So if you look at like elbow flexion, you can find like the bicep muscle, you can find the distinct brachialis muscle, you can find the brachialis, so you can find all these different muscles. So you don't have like a right atrium muscle or a left atrium muscle or a right ventricle. It actually is like one long muscle that's twisted and folded in on itself to form these chambers. So think of like your biceps as one of those long balloons, the clown balloons they use to make shapes from end to end, and then it contracts. Think of cardiac muscle as one of those balloons, but then like twisted and wrapped and turned into a poodle or some kind of a shape or animal. That's what the cardiac muscle, that's what the heart is one long muscle that's kind of wrapped into these different sections, creating these empty chambers that when the heart contracts, so you can kind of see it folded in on itself there. When it contracts, it is squishing the blood from atrium to ventricle and ventricle out.